Welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current show, All We Cannot Forget, curated by Shar Norman. Today, we are thrilled to present the artist Taryn McMahon. As a brief reminder, everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode. Feel free to utilize that chat function to ask questions. We'll be sure to get to them at the end of the talk. Also, please keep in mind that because we're presenting from separate locations, there may be some variation of bandwidth. So if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates, thanks in advance for bearing with us. All right, thanks everyone, and welcome, Taryn.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Kat, for inviting me to give this talk today. And thanks to Shar Norman for inviting me to be in the show. I've been really excited to be a part of this conversation that she started as part of this group of artists making work about the environment. So I'm going to start by telling you just a little bit about me. So I'm currently an associate professor at Kent State University, and my studio and my work everything is based here in Northeast Ohio, where I live with my husband, who's also an artist, and my two young kids, and I have a dog. A little bit about my journey before I get started. I grew up in New Jersey. My BFA, my undergraduate degree, is from Penn State University, where I focused in printmaking. And then I went on to receive my MFA from the University of Iowa, also in printmaking. From there, I lived for a little while in West Virginia. I taught part-time at West Virginia University before accepting this job at Kent State and moving to Northeast Ohio a little over 10 years ago now. And you'll see as a part of this talk that the move to Northeast Ohio and this region in general has had a huge impact on my work as an artist. And as a printmaker by training, I'll say that I try to observe and document my interactions with nature or with the natural world. And I try to be honest and critical with myself about what those interactions are really like. And I try to have an intersectional approach, I would say, to my work and to environmentalism in general. So this is a book, The Intersectional Environmentalist, that I read a few years ago and had a really big impact on how I think about my work as an artist, and how I deal with the images of the environment. And also just really quick, I'll say that I'm going to talk about some of my influences and impact, and then I'm going to get into my work as an artist in a few minutes. So in her book, The Intersectional Environmentalist, Leah Thomas defines intersectional environmentalism as an inclusive approach to environmentalism that advocates for both the protection of people and the planet. Intersectional environmentalism argues that social and environmental justice are intertwined, and that environmental advocacy that disregards this connection is harmful and incomplete. So her book makes really, really clear that women, BIPOC and LGBTQ plus activists and artists have always been at the forefront of environmentalism. And that through their stories and artworks, we can imagine, embody, and visualize new ways of interacting with the natural world. And this was really important for me because I think sometimes this idea of an artist who makes work about landscape or the natural world, we can kind of imagine this like romanticized landscape, you know, John Muir or some of these really well-known white male environmental activists, but there's this whole other history that's less well known that's really important. But before we can imagine and visualize new ways of interacting with the natural world, we need to think about and assess what we currently imagine nature to be, and how did we come to imagine it that way, and what that means and how that impacts how we interact with our world. In 2017, I saw a really impactful lecture by architect and theorist David Rue. And he began by asking everyone in the audience to close their eyes and imagine nature. So I'm going to ask everyone to do the same thing right now. Please just close your eyes and picture nature. All right. Hold that image in your mind now and open your eyes. I'm going to trust that everybody did it. Did any of you imagine something like this? This is Thomas Cole's The Oxbow View from Mount Holyoke, Northampton, Massachusetts, after a thunderstorm from 1836. Some folks, maybe you imagined an animal, maybe something undomesticated like a deer. If you're a little more different, maybe you imagined an insect or bacteria. But I'm curious if anyone imagined themselves, a person. And when I do these, when I've done this before, it's very rare that someone imagines themselves or a person. If they do imagine a person, it's usually a person within a landscape like this. The person is not the nature, but the person is within the nature. And I'm really curious about that, that most of us picture ourselves as human beings as something that is outside of nature. Leah Thomas, again, in the Intersectional Environmentalist, she writes, as a society, we often forget that humans are a part of our global ecosystem and that we don't exist separately from nature. We coexist with it each and every day. That very idea of nature that we have, that first image that you pictured, the idea that that's what nature is, that is itself a man-made idea. And of course, this has political, social, and ecological implications. And I also want to be really clear that that picture has been shaped by artists. So back to this painting. So Cole was a member of the Hudson River School, although he was born in England and he immigrated to the US in 1818. And you can see when you look at this painting that it's clearly marked into two halves. The left half is untamed, wild nature. It elicits awe, but maybe also fear and danger. The weather is dark and stormy. The right side, by contrast, shows a peaceful pastoral landscape dotted with small farms and grazing animals. The sun shines brightly. Taken together, and also in the context of the US in 1836, this painting is a visualization and embodiment of manifest destiny. The racist and genocidal idea that white Americans were divinely ordained to spread westward and settle all of North America. The left half is the West, wild, waiting to become ordered, and the right half is the East, already peacefully tamed by white settlers. Clearly, the images that artists construct of nature reveal our ideologies and deepest desires. How we construct pictures of nature is political and it has consequences. Another one of my influences is Timothy Morton. So in his book, Ecology Without Nature, Timothy Morton perfectly sums up this idea when he states, it is in art that the fantasies we have about nature take shape and dissolve. Morton argues that in order to have a properly ecological worldview, we need to urgently dispense with the idea of nature altogether, that it's too romantic and too unlinked from reality. So if we're able to get rid of this idea that there is this thing called nature, it's separate from us, then we'll actually get closer to having an ecological worldview. But this begs, brings me to the point that if art is part of the problem, how we have historically depicted nature, if that's part of the problem, art is also the cure, right? So art can create new ways of looking at the natural world, of thinking about what is nature, how do we interact with it? And of course, for me as a printmaker who's trained not just in the techniques of print, but in the history of printmaking, I know that the history of printmaking is part of this legacy of how we create images of so-called nature or the natural world. I think especially about early botanical woodcuts and engravings that were made during the 1700s and 1800s, during, the widespread growth of colonialism, and especially the invention of the classification of species. In her book, The Insect and the Image, Janice Neary coined the term specimen logic to refer to the framing devices that many artists used in these works. And when she says specimen logic, what she means is that an insect or a plant would be isolated on the page, freed from the rest of their environment, and rendered in exquisite, stiff detail. And this tendency to separate, classify, and categorize the natural world prevents a holistic or ecological viewpoint of interactions or systems. And I think as people, we are just now in the last few years waking up to this idea that we exist within a vast entangled mesh, that the world is inextricably linked. We cannot actually separate things out in that way. And those systems are really important. Nothing exists in isolation. So I want to show you another one of my influences is Maria Sibylla Marion, who was an artist working in the late 1600s, early 1700s. And on the left is a watercolor study of hers. And on the right is an artist, Johann Gudert, one of her approximate contemporaries working in the late 1600s. And he was a Dutch naturalist. And Maria Sibylla Marion was also a Dutch naturalist working at roughly the same time. But you can see when you compare these two how different their approach is. So Gudert was working from dried specimens, and I think that's really clear in the way that he lays out his composition. The scientific classification of species was not yet published, but the idea of capturing and categorizing every living thing was gaining traction. And he neatly and accurately captures and categorizes the stages of a caterpillar turning into a butterfly in this linear way, 1, 2, 3. By contrast, Marion on the left is depicting an entire ecosystem. As equally interesting to me as her compositions is her life as a woman artist in her time. She was a mother, a wife, and a prolific publisher of engravings. One thing that was unique about her at that time is that she actually raised butterflies and watched and observed them throughout their life cycles. So she wasn't working from dried specimens. Here she shows the caterpillar, the chrysalis, the parasitic flies that sometimes overtook the chrysalis, the butterfly, and the plant that sustains it all. Rather than a linear or hierarchical composition, it is organized roughly in a circular composition. In other words, it's a never-ending cycle, and one that is open to change depending on any one of the variables. So again, I come back to this idea that how an artist constructs images of nature reveals what they think about the world. It reveals their deepest ideologies and their desires. How we construct nature has political, social, and ecological consequences. Another influence of mine is the artist Anna Atkins, who is working in the mid-1800s. And in 2019, I was really lucky to take a group of students to see a rare exhibition of her cyanotypes at the New York Public Library, and that's what this photograph is from. Atkins created the world's first book of photography when she published photographs of British algae cyanotype impressions in 1843. An avid botanist, Atkins painstakingly collected and dried her specimens. Her work reveals her interests in science, technology, photography, and art. Here's a detail of one of her plates from that book. One of the things I think that is really interesting about Atkins is that there's evidence that she received a camera in 1841 when photography was first invented by William Fox Talbot. She and her father, a scientist, made calotypes together. And 20 years before making her cyanotypes, Atkins also completed 256 scientifically accurate illustrations of shells for a book by her father. So she had access to a camera and to other photographic processes, as well as skills in illustration, and she had access to scientific communities and publishers. Why is that significant to me? Because it makes clear that she very intentionally chose the process of cyanotype, which is a camera-less mode of photographically recording something. So she very intentionally chose the process of coating paper with a light sensitive material and making a print through direct exposure of the object. In 1843, she wrote to a friend, "I have lately taken in hand a rather lengthy performance. It is the taking of photographical impressions of all that I can procure of British algae and confervae, many of which are so minute that accurate drawings of them are very difficult to make." So while these prints accurately capture the silhouettes of the objects, another thing that interests me about Atkins is that she was also arranging creative compositions and clearly exploring transparency, opacity, subtle layering, and texture. So like Maria Sibylla Merian, Anna Atkins is working in this mode between science and art. That's part of what interests me about both of them. They're accurately capturing something, but they're also using their voice to create something creative that says something about the natural world. So to me, these are portraits of a place and of plants without the romanticism of landscape paintings like the one I talked about earlier that was being produced by other artists at the exact same time, mid-1800s. These, by contrast, are intimate, they're local, they're focused on preservation and collaboration rather than domination. They encourage us to look closely and locally. You don't have to be alone in the wilderness to appreciate the natural world. It's in and around us all the time. So another thing I think about a lot is our current state of ecology and how it's so complex. So nature is also deeply intertwined with the man-made at this point in time. We cannot separate them anymore at this point. And one fantastic example of this is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which this is a picture of on your screen right now. This is the ocean's biggest garbage pile. And the New York Times reported that scientists have found that small sea creatures exist in equal numbers with pieces of trash in the patch. The patch, in other words, is less a garbage island than it is a garbage soup of plastic bottles, fishing nets, tires, and toothbrushes. And floating at its surface are blue dragon, nudibranchs, Portuguese man-o'-wars, and other small surface-dwelling animals, which are collectively known as newstin. Any large-scale removal of plastic from the patch could pose a threat to its newstin inhabitants. So for better or for worse, our garbage is part of our ecosystem. I think a lot about this idea of connectedness and how at this point in time, it's not so clear to me anymore what is nature and what isn't. What is the right path forward in situations like this? How do we go about managing ecology at this time when nature and the man-made can no longer really be separated? So this brings me to my recent project on the Cuyahoga River and Breakneck Creek, which is a watershed of the Cuyahoga River in Northeast Ohio. This recent series, is called A Series of Entanglements. And I was really interested in exploring water and natural spaces around me in my everyday life, specifically the Cuyahoga River and its watersheds. And I started this in 2019. These spaces are very highly managed by people. There's a lot of intervention that happens to prevent erosion or to manage the ecology. and they are significant points of interaction between the human and non-human. If you don't know the history of the Cuyahoga River, it has played a significant role in the history of ecological understanding in the United States. One thing it's really famous for is having been so polluted that it caught fire in 1969. And that set off a movement that eventually led to the founding of the EPA and the passage of the Clean Water Act. And while the Cuyahoga River is in much better health ecologically today than it was in the 60s or 70s, it remains a significant point of interaction, and there's still a lot more that can be done. I often walk along the river and, like I said, Breakneck Creek. Breakneck Creek is a watershed of the Cuyahoga River that goes right behind my house in my backyard. And during the pandemic, I was walking along there nearly every day because it was right there and it was accessible. And I began to collect objects from the banks of the Cuyahoga River and Breakneck Creek. Consumer plastics and abandoned fishing supplies, in addition to naturally occurring objects such as algae and stones. And I started to use these objects to make cyanotypes and monotypes. So this is a research image that I took of the Cuyahoga River. It shows some old railroad ties, rocks, leaves. And I was also really interested in shallow spaces like this, where you can see lots of different objects suspended in this shallow space, suspended in the water. And you'll see that influence in my monotypes when I start talking about those. This is my trusty assistant, Bucky. He's always up for a walk and for getting into the water to help me collect some stuff. And you can see floating in front of him is a plastic water bottle that we collected. There's some sticks, there's lots of rocks, there's leaves. Again, all of those things suspended in the water, and that's the kind of shallow layering in space that I often try to capture in my monotype prints. And also I want to just say too, I grew up, my dad was a sanitation worker. He was very passionate about recycling. Like, he was an early advocate of recycling in the town that I grew up in and that I lived in. And we would do things like go to the county fair every year and like show people how you could, how to compost, or how you could take old license plates and make things out of them, or how you could take plastic water bottles and shred them and like turn them into other things. And clearly, like, that experience has had a continuing impact on me and my work. So this is one monotype from the series of entanglements. So to make the monotypes, I start by taking the silhouettes of the objects that I've collected and tracing them onto Mylar, or sometimes I use craft foam actually. And I cut out the silhouettes and then layer them with different colors of ink, highly transparent inks. I sort of build, if you don't know anything about printmaking or monotypes, I sort of take those stencils and build the image on a plexiglass plate with all of this layering and run it through a press with a piece of paper against it to transfer those silhouettes onto the piece of paper. So each unique print weaves together the man-made and the natural. And I think that this results in sort of visual environments that reiterate the entanglement of the current state of ecology. And this idea that the human and non-human can't be pulled apart anymore. There's plastic water bottles, leaves, sticks, rocks, chunks of styrofoam, all in here, and they're all given the same sort of treatment. Like, you can't quite tell which is one and which is the other. Like, you can sort of tell, maybe you think that this is a rock or a chunk of bark, but maybe it's actually the silhouette of a chunk of styrofoam or a plastic bag. And at the same time that I'm thinking about these concepts, I'm also thinking very formally. I'm thinking about layering, space, movement, color, and how I can just make interesting compositions. Some of the prints have more realistic colors, like shades of blue, and then in others, I'm pushing the color a bit to see what happens with some artificiality introduced, like this hot pink. and trying to have fun with color relationships. So sometimes I'm just, I have all these heavy ideas that I'm thinking about when I'm collecting the objects and formulating the idea for the series. But then when I'm at the press, I'm also just having fun with color, having fun with composition, seeing if I can make something beautiful and interesting and layered and complex. So this one is a monotype and graphite. So I monotype printed the rocks, and then I went in and I drew the netting that you see over the whole thing with graphite. I became really interested during the pandemic in the erosion netting that I often saw along parts of the Cuyahoga River. And it started for me to become a metaphor of this attempt to control something in an environment that is very chaotic and that you can't really control. And the erosion netting is this attempt to put stability in an environment where everything is actually always in motion. Everything is always moving. Rivers actually move quite a bit. They don't stay where they are. And so I became very interested in the erosion netting, and you'll see that in some more upcoming pieces. So most of these monotypes are just 1 or 2 runs through the press. I do a lot of the layering physically on the plexiglass plate. Sometimes I'm doing techniques like shinkole, where I'm monotype onto like a thin Japanese style paper. And then I'm also monotyping onto a thicker Western style paper. And then I'm cutting out the thin Japanese style paper, gluing it on to the thicker Western paper, and running it through the press to create even more depth and layering. It's a way to get maybe brighter colors right on top of another and not have it turn so muddy like some of the other ones get a little bit convoluted. So this one is monotype in shinkole. And if you're interested, what is shinkole? So on the Western paper is this pink that's printed, and then a sort of muted purplish navy that's printed. And then the shinkole is the bright turquoise shapes. So I became very interested specifically in the erosion netting at the same time. This is from 2021. And I had been working on these prints all throughout 2020 and 2021. And I wanted to make a series of monotypes just of the erosion netting. So I started by making the same monotypes, very similar to the ones I just showed you, onto thin Japanese style paper. And then I made an Illustrator file of the erosion netting and took them to the laser cutter on campus at Kent State and cut them out. So what you see is the white here is their actual voids, right? So when you pick up this print, it's mostly, there's more empty space. There's more that's removed than there is actually left there. It's like lace. It's very fragile. But at the same time, because it's on this Japanese style paper with these long fibers, it's actually surprisingly strong too. And so then I would monotype onto them, cut them out on the laser cutter, and then I would sort of like crumple them up and run them back through the press to make them look sort of worn and to give them this crumpling and this feeling of time, of being worn. And that's what the erosion netting that I often see actually looks like. It's been there a long time. It's covering the soil and the rocks. And this is a detail of that piece. I made 4 of these that are like in various colors, but all very similar to this. And you can see, where the white is, it's physically cut out. And you can see the kind of dimensionality of them. So at the same time that I work on the monotypes, I'm also always working on these larger banner pieces. This piece called Impressions, Cuyahoga River, started as a smaller cyanotype, probably about 22 by 30. I scanned it in at a really high resolution and then inkjet printed it on canvas to make it it's about 12 feet high, 10 feet wide at this point. I printed it on 3 strips of inkjet printable canvas, each one about 3 feet wide, and then sewed them together to make this larger piece. I was really interested in the draping that would happen when it printed so large and hung in the space. And I was also really interested in what happens with the scale when they become an architectural scale, and when it becomes larger than the viewer. So what I was thinking about when I made this was, how does that change how we see these objects when it becomes bigger than us? Do they become more important? Do we pay more attention? How does it feel to have this literally looming over you in the space? I read this book when I was a grad student called On Longing by Susan Stewart, where she talks about how she talks about scale, and she talks about how anything smaller than us is diminutive. It's something that we're able to control. It's something that's, if it's smaller than a person, it feels domesticated to us, subconsciously. If it's bigger than us, it feels not controllable. It feels like architecture, like weather, like a landscape. So I was really interested in this idea of playing with the scale and seeing what happens when something small scale becomes big scale, and how we respond to that. So these cyanotypes include fishing netting, scraps of plastic and styrofoam, branches, leaves, water bottles. This one has a juice box in it somewhere, I think. And this really goes back to those early cyanotypes I showed by Anna Atkins, and how she was documenting the ecology of her time. And I feel like that's what I'm trying to do too. I'm trying to document and archive the ecology of my time, the things that I experience when I experience nature. And so that was in 2023, that last piece. And so then this brings me to my current project, or my most recent project, where I was exploring Dunkard Creek, which is a watershed of the Monongahela River in West Virginia. Like I said, I lived in West Virginia for a little while before I came to Kent State. My husband has family there and we go back there often. So this is another place that is very close to me and that I walk along often and that I see often. And I became very interested in Dunkard Creek partly because it's also, I think it's a significant ecological place, and it has an interesting history. So when I started looking into it, I started reading about how Dunkard Creek was named for members of the Dunkard Brethren, a pacifist, nonconformist Christian group who settled in that region of West Virginia during the 18th century and practiced baptism by immersion. And in 2009, all of the fish, over 160 species, mussels, about 17 species, several of which were endangered, aquatic salamanders and crayfish, basically everything in Dunkard Creek was killed by a toxic algae bloom that was likely caused by illegal discharge from a local coal mine. The local ecology there was unique. Its destruction was nearly total and unprecedented. And although the DNR began restocking the creek and trying to bring it back to its natural state, will it ever be the same? In my mind, obviously, no. And also there, like many bodies of water, one can also easily find consumer plastics, old tires, other detritus, but also rocks, plants, and wildlife. And so I began this project by, much like my last one with the Cuyahoga River, by walking along and floating along Dunkard Creek to collect natural and man-made objects. So this is a picture of the creek, and you can see my husband all the way in the background. He's really tiny, helping me collect things. My dog and my kids also enjoyed helping. They love, running out into the creek and being like, "Mom, I found a water bottle. I found this glass bottle for you. I found this or that." After collecting all these items, I had a residency at the Center for Contemporary Printmaking in Connecticut, and I brought boxes of stuff there. Dried plants, boxes of, I'll show you all that in a minute. To the Center for Contemporary Printmaking to be the basis of this new body of work. So these are photographs of dried plants that I found in Dunkard Creek and pressed flat to dry. I also found a dead crayfish. It was already dead. I didn't kill it or take a live one, and I wasn't the cause of its demise. And I added that to the collection. And about 6 years ago, so well before this project, I collaborated with a biologist at Kent State, and her specialty was botany. And she did a project with me where we went around the area in Kent and we collected some samples of plants, and she showed me how she dries them and collects them and archives them, and how they're stored at the herbarium at Kent State for study by others. Anybody can come and study the plants that are in there. So I was really interested in that process and starting a kind of archive of my own. So these are more plants collected and dried from Dunkard Creek. And then these are some of the other items that I collected that are just archived in boxes. There's rocks, shells, and natural items like that, as well as man-made items. Like you can see here, there's a crushed aluminum can, there's a rubber hose, there's part of a glass bottle, parts of discarded tires. There's this really, at the bottom, really raggedy, but interesting and beautiful in its own way, piece of scrap metal. And then the next part of this project was, after collecting everything and archiving it, to make cyanotypes of the objects, just to be another way of documenting them. And these are the monotypes that I made at the Center for Contemporary Printmaking at my residency. So once I had the items and they were archived and I had made the cyanotypes, I started to use those silhouettes to trace the outlines of the objects onto Mylar, and again, thin sheets of craft foam. Cut those out with an X-Acto knife to make the stencils, and then ink up the stencils and layer them on a plexiglass plate to create some depth and layering, and then run it through the press. And this one is called Everything We Lost. So these are all from 2024. So these are quite recent. This one's called Divining Rod. So I'm also really interested in talking to people about water and its importance in our lives and the relationship with water. And this title, Divining Rod, if you don't know, a divining rod is a forked stick or rod that the user walks around with to try to locate the presence of underground water. So people would use this technique. It's a pseudoscience. It's not based in any type of scientific reality, but people would use it when trying to find a good place to put a well, or when they were trying to find water, essentially. And my dad showed me how to use a divining rod when I was little. And I've talked to other people since who have said, oh yeah, my dad used a divining rod when trying to find a place to put a well for a cabin that we built, or this or that. So I find that very interesting, people's relationship with water and how important it is, and superstitions around water. So the title of this, Water Witching, is another term for finding water with a divining rod. The title of this monotype, Impressions Dunkard Creek, is a nod to Anna Atkins, who called her prints cyanotype impressions. And while I was at the residency at the Center for Contemporary Printmaking, I had brought this gorgeous blue paper with me, and I had a lot of fun experimenting with printing on it. It's this beautiful medium blue, and what my strategy was to start printing a deeper blue into it to give it some value change, and then also printing white and a limited color palette back into it to give it, the darks and the lights. And so sometimes when people see these, they think that they're cyanotypes that I've also monotype printed on, which of course I'm very interested in that reference. And this one's called I've Made My Bed. And you can see, like, those objects that I showed you, you can see the silhouettes of the plants, but also the rocks, a rubber hose, the crushed aluminum can. This one's called What Was It That I Did? So from there, I went back to making another larger scale piece. I loved the blue paper so much that I commissioned the Morgan Conservatory in Cleveland to make some huge sheets of paper for me to print on. So this piece is 120 inches tall, so it's about 10 feet tall. It's 80 inches wide. And so it's 4 sheets of really big handmade paper. Each sheet of handmade paper, I think, was maybe 40 by 60. And I glued those together and screen printed onto it. So for this piece, it started again as a smaller cyanotype of the items from Dunkard Creek. And again, I knew I wanted to create this bigger scale piece as a part of this series about Dunkard Creek, like in some of the earlier banner works that I showed. But this time I didn't want to print them digitally. I wanted to enlarge it by hand and print it by hand. So I started by gridding off the cyanotype. Like if you've ever done that in like a drawing class or like as a drawing exercise, you grid the smaller drawing and then you grid the larger sheet of paper and then you transfer each square from the smaller size squares to the bigger size squares and you end up with an enlarged drawing at the end. So that's how I approached this. And I was gridding these huge pieces of frosted mylar to create the stencils for screen printing and transferring all of the information by hand and hand painted the transparencies. And then I exposed them onto silk screens and then printed them in white ink onto the blue paper again to give this feeling of kind of like a cyanotype, but a huge one. And this piece was shown at the Screen Print Biennial at the Jenner Turner Print Museum in California this past fall. And now as a part of that show, it's going to travel to the Alpaca Gallery in New York in the next few weeks, I think. So in the upcoming future, I see myself, in the immediate future, I see myself continuing to work with this huge blue paper. I absolutely love it. And I want to continue to work on it by hand with screen printing, but also I'm very interested in drawing onto it with white Conte and getting more of some of the subtle things that are happening in the cyanotypes, but in this bigger format. And you can see lots more of my work on my website and on Instagram. And now I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Taryn. Yeah, folks, if you have questions, pop them into the chat and I will pull them up. Um, so Taryn, I'm curious, the body of work that you chatted with us about is so deeply rooted in the American kind of Midwest, the nature found here. And I'm curious, lots of artists will travel and have experiences there. You said you went to Connecticut and brought with you your items. I'm curious if you ever uh, look for residencies outside of a landscape that is more native for you, and how does that play into, or how do you work against that? I'm just curious about your thought process and how you manage that.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. Well, I'm gonna start answering that by going like way, way back in time, way, way back in time. So I grew up in New Jersey. I went to Penn State for my undergraduate degree. And when I graduated from Penn State in 2006, I had never been farther west than Pittsburgh. But I got this residency in Lawrence, Kansas at the Lawrence Art Center. And it was a year-long residency. And part of it was like managing their print shop and teaching community classes at their art center, like drawing and printmaking. And I remember like packing everything I owned, which was not much, into my little car and like moving out to Lawrence, Kansas, and just being completely blown away, like completely blown away. Like once you get to Ohio, which, you know, Ohio's the gateway to the Midwest, it changes a little bit, but then once you get past Ohio and you go through like um Missouri, Iowa, Kansas, anywhere like that, and the way that the landscape just completely opens up, and you could just like you could see weather coming for hours before it would get to you. It just completely blew my mind. And I don't think up until that point I had thought about, how being in a different location would change my work, but like it clearly did. And then I went to, from there I lived in Madison, Wisconsin for a little while my husband went to graduate school, and then I went to graduate school in Iowa, and I ended up just in the Midwest for a long time. And now I'm in Ohio, which is sort of the gateway to the Midwest. Um, so yeah, I'm very interested in going to places that have a very different kind of landscape, but I feel totally rooted in this Midwest American landscape right now, and the way that um, it feels, the way that it's so industrial. It's very different than, if you go way out west. Like once you get past the Midwest, you start getting out to like Colorado, Utah, California, and it feels completely different. But in the Midwest, yeah, there's just this I think it's very unique. So I don't know. I don't know if I have a good answer to that. I guess when I'm looking at residencies, I'm looking more at where does a place what do they have in terms of like printmaking equipment? Can I make my work there? Um, am I going to get the time and space to do what I need to do? And then also as someone who has a young family, I'm more interested in like 1 or 2 week residencies, which the Center for Contemporary Printmaking was like very accommodating for that. They were so accommodating to me as a parent. Like they were amazing. And so at this point, those are more of my criteria for residency. But yeah, I'm interested in how being where you are changes, uh your relationship to the work that you're making.
Great. Thank you so much.
Great.
We have a question from John Michael, who would like to know, what are some of the experiences and lessons you've taken in the shift from smaller and large scale works?
Oh, some of the lessons. Hi, John Michael. I'm so glad I didn't know you were here before I started talking, because now that's making me so nervous. Some of the lessons, uh, I think when I first started making large scale work, I was like, this is all that I want to do. I loved the impact that it had. I loved how it took up space. I love that like it immediately captures people when they come in. It's like this architectural scale. But I think what I've learned over time is that the smaller work has so much value too, because this more intimate experience, this more like you have to walk right up to it. You really have to pay attention to all the details, the subtlety of what's happening in the surface. Something bigger, you can kind of understand it from being farther away from it. So I guess the lessons that I've taken with me is that I like to go back and forth with scale. I appreciate what different scales can give the viewer and how they change the viewer's experience. Do you walk around the object? Are you in its space, or is it in your space? And I like it when the viewer sort of in an exhibition can go back and forth between those different ways of experiencing something. Thank you for asking that question.
So, this deep value of the model prints and cyanotypes, you've developed a clear kind of language around the cyanotypes, and you're breaking away from it in some of the works. Can you talk a little bit about when you choose to break away from that? How are you making those choices? Are they, influenced from something else? Can you chat just a bit about when you break out of the parameters that you've set for yourself? How are you making those choices?
Yeah, I think as an artist, it's really fruitful to like set up rules and then but then also selectively break those rules when you want to. I mean, as a printmaker, I love limits. Like we're always limited by the size of the press, the size of the paper, the size of the plexiglass, the size of our brayers. Like there's so many limits, and I understand that some people find that to be something that's really frustrating about printmaking. That's something I actually really love about printmaking, because I think it forces a different kind of creativity, and a way of thinking economically, and a way of thinking that is, for me, it's really fruitful of, how you can address those limits and how you can break out of them in surprising ways, but then sometimes how you have to work creatively within them. And so I think setting up rules for myself, or not rules, but more like loose boundaries or limits, is something that's really fruitful for me in my practice. So um I'll stick with something for a while, like being really interested in the cyanotypes and being really influenced by the cyanotypes, and then I'll just want to, break that rule and like put a hot pink color in there or do something really unexpected, that keeps it really interesting for me. I'm looking at lots of different other things. Like I'm not just like the things that I've showed you as a selection, but I'm looking at a lot of painters. I'm looking at installation artists. Um, I'm looking at a lot of other artists who do a lot of drawing, and so I'm always I'm not just thinking about the cyanotypes, and so I'm I can't really say how when I decide to be more faithful to this idea of the cyanotypes and when I move away from that. It's again, I have all these ideas, but then when I'm working at the press, it's like drawing, or it's very much like I let those rules go. I have these ideas, and then when I get to the press, I have all these stencils. I'm mixing colors, and I'm more interested in making something, that excites me in terms of the color, in terms of the layering, the compositions, the formal qualities of the thing that I'm making. And that means that, in order to get like the 10 prints in the series that I show, I mean, I make 20 plus. Like, I don't even know how many I make. And like half of them just end up in a drawer, or maybe they'll get cut up and turned into something else at some other point. But, you know, so I'm open to like experimenting, and then, it's a practice, but part of it is going back and being like, okay, what worked and what didn't work? What kind of does what I want it to and what doesn't?
We have a question from Ben who says, "Thank you, Taryn. Minor curiosity. The blue painter's tape in your photo of drying the specimens is very intriguing given the shared color, but also ideas of suspension and the human natural contrast that you're working with as a technical and conceptual framework throughout your work. Is this a material you've considered experimenting with?"
Um, Not really, but that's a great point and a great question. Yeah. That's really interesting, and I hadn't thought about that. And now that I look back, it's funny how sometimes I think as artists, like we have our point of view and we don't, or for me as an artist, I have my point of view and I don't really think outside of that. And like I love blue painter's tape. I prefer it to regular masking tape. I prefer it to like the green frog tape. And like now that I'm thinking about it, it's like, is that the color or is that because of how it actually performs?
Interesting. And so Ben had a follow-up, which is, do you have future plans to continue exploring handmade paper? All right, I think Taryn has frozen on us a bit. We'll give it just a beat. See if she's able to join us once again. Ah, All right. Well, I think that is a natural closeout for us then, for this artist talk. Um, Thank you again, Taryn, for the generosity of your time and talent. Thank you all for joining us for this artist talk by Taryn McMahon as a part of our programming for All We Cannot Forget. Special thank you to the curator, Char Norman. A big thank you to the participating artists, as well as the Ohio Arts Council's board, the Ohio legislature, and the governor who support the Ohio Arts Council, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists. Thank you so much, Taryn. Really appreciate you being here and sharing your talents with us.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, I think Zoom booted me off and then I was able to get back on. So,
Well, since you're here, if there's anything you want to close out with, this is your opportunity to do so.
no, just thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. I really enjoyed sharing my work with you. I know you have a lot in this holiday season that you could be spending your time doing. So I really appreciate you taking an hour to spend this time learning about my work. Thanks again to Kat for having me, and thanks to Char Norman for curating the show and asking me to be a part of it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Taryn. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye. Thank you.